Hey everybody, welcome back. Today is July 3rd, 2023. I'm Alan Anand. I want to discuss today two topics which I have broached before, both in written form, Putin's horoscope and the launch of his special military operation in Ukraine, both of which I've discussed on my website, navamsha.com, dating back to November 2018 for Putin's horoscope, and early March of 2022, about a week after the launch of the Ukraine war. So back in the day, in November 2018, I'd rectified Putin's horoscope. I'll get into some details shortly, but I received a lot of flack at the time for my choice of ascendant, and I'll get into that shortly as well too. Notwithstanding the storm of protests I receive, I believe that this horoscope still stands up very well. In light of past events and current events, and as I will attempt to use that as a springboard to look into the future a bit for Putin and Russia as well too. The other horoscope, much more reliable in the sense because it was based upon events that were whose timeline was released in the last week of February 2022, when Russia's special military operation was launched against Ukraine. And that has some very interesting ramifications as well too. And I talked about it at the time on my website, and I also did a YouTube segment on that as well too. But that was early on, and subsequent events have simply proved that that horoscope, what we could call a muhurta, or an event horoscope, has proved to have some very interesting consequences. So I'm going to pull both of those together, Putin's horoscope and the launch for the Ukraine war, together in this discussion. And there's an interesting symbiosis in all of that. So let's get to those particular horoscopes now. Thank you. Okay, so here is the horoscope for Vladimir Putin. You can see the birth date up here, 7th of October, 1952. I'm using a time of 9:19 in the morning, St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, Astrodienst posts a time of 9:30 in the morning, ostensibly from some official source in Russia. Now, at the time that I posted this horoscope, I got a storm of protest. Basically, people saying no possible way could Putin be having a Libra ascendant. I mean, the guy's a criminal and a thug and a killer, yada, yada, yada. Obviously, these people don't know that Napoleon was a Libra rising. So too was Mussolini. So too was Hitler. So I don't see any reason why Putin can't have a Libra rising as well. Anyway, be that as it may, I mean, a lot of people said, look, if it's information released by the Russian government, well, then you can't possibly believe it, especially if it involves, a former KGB guy. Well, be that as it may, I used 7th of October 52 as a launch point, and that birth time as a launch point as well. And I ended up, to make a long story short, I tweaked that birth time by a mere 11 minutes earlier to arrive at 9:19. Now, my methodology, which I described in, excruciating detail in my website, navamsha.com, and the title of that piece was Vladimir Putin, the spy who came home with the gold. You can read that at your leisure, but basically I use Amsha Vichara, which is the analysis of the divisional charts, to correlate with the many life events: marriage, divorce, birth of children, political ascendancy, on and on with his career successes and his, massive money-making capacities. So I'm just going to hit the highlights of this horoscope. I've defended it at length in in my article on my website. People say, well, Libra rising, and especially Venus in the first house, how could that possibly, reflect a man with such, ominous power? Well, be reminded that, Venus Swarashi in a Kendra is Malavya Yoga, one of the great Panchamahapurush yogas, sign of a king or a great leader. So this can give, vigor, personality, physical endurance, charisma of some sort, whatever. So that's all well and good. Now, I'll cut to the chase. There's a significant yoga here. Venus and Jupiter are in Sambandha because they are mutually aspect each other. Both are powerful. Venus because it's in its own sign. Jupiter because it is retrograde and therefore brighter than normal. Now, what's interesting about these two, although they're both benefics, they are both lords of Trikashtanas. Jupiter owns the 6th, Venus owns the 8th. If you look closely, no other planet associates with nor aspects those two. So they act alone, with each other in tandem, in Sambandha, and they are Trikashtana lords. Now, this perfectly fulfills the definition of Viparita Raja Yoga, when two trick lords interact by association or mutual aspect in any house whatsoever and are under no influence from any non-trick lord. They form Viparita Raja Yoga. Now, in the real world, how does this manifest? Well, it can be somebody who thrives under difficult circumstances, who may even create difficult circumstances in order to thrive in those. You can think of it a bit like, the cloud with the silver lining, even if that cloud is of your own making. So it can reflect a person who can thrive on competition, that's Jupiter, Lord of the 6th, and thrive on, life or death struggles and transformative circumstances, and that's Venus as Lord of the 8th. And be reminded that they both have strength. That's one of the critical elements of the definition in Uttara Kalamrita. This is a very powerful yoga in Putin's chart. Now, there's a bunch of Dana yogas here in the 12th house. Sun is Lord of the 11th. Mercury is Lord of the 9th, and Saturn Lord of the 5th. That perfectly fulfills the definition for classic Dana yoga, when you get a combination of a money lord, a lord of 2 or 11, combined with a trinal lord, 1, 5, or 9. So there's a couple of those in that 12th house. So what else is salient about this horoscope? Mars in Sagittarius, Jupiter in Aries. Most people recognize that readily as being a Parivartana yoga, a mutual reception, a sign exchange. This is especially powerful. Not only are they in a Sambandha because of the Parivartana, but Jupiter also aspects Mars. Or you could look at it the other, Jupiter, who is disposited by Mars, aspects that Mars. And Mars, who disposits Jupiter, is aspected by that Jupiter. Anyway, that is another form of Sambandha, when a unilateral aspect from one graha to another is between one with a dispositor relationship. This creates, athleticism. Putin's long been a judo aficionado. He prides himself on playing hockey, competing in judo events, being otherwise, an outdoorsy sportsman, swimming in cold rivers and hunting and all the rest of that. So he projects this image of, strength and daring do and bravado. And this can be seen in this very yoga, the Parivartana between Mars and Jupiter. Third house is, skills, strength, athleticism, bravery, courage, risk-taking too, we might add, and its combination with Jupiter can create a kind of a warlike disposition. Now, when Putin launched his war on Ukraine, which had been building for some time, remember that Russia had annexed Crimea, which had belonged to Ukraine back in 2014, and there were some brief fighting, and then it was over, and the world did not protest. This time around, it's different, but it obviously emboldened Putin to go for more. So and over the years, I mean, he's grumbled about the fall of the USSR and the dissolution of the great Soviet Empire. And approaching age 70, I think that he wanted his legacy to be that of the Russian leader who reunited the great Russian Empire. And so he's had his sight on any number of states, like whether it's Finland or Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine, all of which used to be part of the USSR. And it bugs him to no end that they've slipped away into the Western camp. So he made up a whole lot of excuses why Ukraine was a cesspool of Nazis, and how he had to go in there and do some cleansing in order to protect Russia's borders. I mean, it's kind of a false flag operation. Well, not technically, but a lot of propaganda leading up to this. So at the time of this adventure that he launched, Putin was running Saturn, Dasha, Jupiter, Bukti. Now both are interestingly linked to Mars. Saturn is in a nakshatra of Mars, so according to some principles, Nadi astrology, or more specifically, Krishnamurti Padati, a period lord will primarily give the results of its nakshatra dispositor. So in Saturn Dasha, it gives the results primarily for Mars, and Mars is this graha in the third house, which represents athleticism, strength, boldness, risk-taking. And this Mars is intimately connected with Jupiter, which also has this notion of expansionism. And indeed, it was running Jupiter Bukti at the time of this. Now Jupiter gives the results for Venus. And so partly this is a bit of a reputation buffing, if you like, that Putin wanted to engage in as he approached his 70th birthday, that it would look good on his resume, in a sense that he had recaptured Ukraine and folded it back into the loving embrace of the motherland. Well, a lot of Ukrainians had other ideas. So this has kind of gone sideways in a big way. In a way, notwithstanding a lot of criticism and objection that I got to this particular horoscope, I believe it still holds water even to this day, and that's like 5 years after I posted it. So now let's take a brief pause here. Okay, so this is the chart for the launch of the special military operation in Ukraine. If you might recall, in Putin's chart, Sagittarius was in his third house, which is where Mars was. So you'll note in this horoscope that Mars has returned to its own place. Sorry, not its own place, but back to Sagittarius. So it was transiting his third house at the time of this launch. So this occurred, as near as I can make out based on media reports at the time. The special military operation, the invasion of Ukraine, was launched around 4:30 in the morning of 24th February 2022. Now, you can tell that there was no astrologer involved in the launch date or time of this particular campaign, because it's about as bad as it can be. And I wrote this up again on my website, and also talked a bit about it in a YouTube post about a week after the event. And again, I got a storm of protest from a lot of Russophiles, I guess, who could not believe what I was saying, that this campaign was not going to bode well for Russia, that it was kind of a mess from the get-go. And little did I know at that time, just a week into the war, what a mess it would turn out to be. But here's what I said at the time based upon what I could see in this horoscope. Why is this a bad horoscope for the launch of a war? Well, for starters, you have Graha Yuddha, planetary war, occurring right here in the first house. So notice that Venus is at 2739 of Sagittarius, Mars at 2816 Sagittarius. Now, this planetary war had been developing with the Venus had come out of a retrograde movement, was moving very slowly. Mars overtook it. And then Venus came out of its retrograde motion, went direct, and caught up with Mars. So what happened during this era from mostly the whole of, from about mid-February or early February into early March, this was a very protracted Graha Yuddha, especially among two, planets that are not, slow moving typically. It's not Saturn and Jupiter we're talking about, but Venus and Mars. Anyway, this was a very protracted planetary war. So this was launched under that kind of cloud. Planetary war is never good, even though you can technically determine a winner, and it's usually the brighter of the two grahas, or it's the more elevated by latitude of the two grahas, or it's the graha that's moving faster. But like any war, no matter the winner and the loser, there is always collateral damage, and that's the takeaway from this. So to have Graha Yuddha in the ascendant, in fact, fairly close to the ascendant point, at the time of this launch is not a good picture. And it's a defining factor of the horoscope because they're the only two grahas in Kendras. Okay, be that as it may, let's go on further. So, the perpetrator or the person launching the attack is going to be indicated by the first house. So Sagittarius, that's going to be Jupiter. So here we have Jupiter at 18 degrees and change of Aquarius. What's notable about this is that Jupiter is, under mild combustion, because look at the degree of the sun, 1117. So that's about 7 degrees and change. It falls within, the zone that we would refer to as mild combustion. But what happens as time goes by? The sun advances each day by 1 degree, and after about 7 days and change, you will see the sun will close on Jupiter, even though Jupiter moves forward a little bit. The sun will catch it 7 or 8 days and totally combust it. Now, that's the ascendant lord getting combusted. That's not a good sign as well, too. And keep in mind here, the timeline is 7 or 8 or 9 days, let's say. Just doing the math, 7. But Jupiter is moving a little bit here as well, too. So it takes sun a bit longer to catch up. So that's not a good prognosis either for the attacker. Again, Sagittarius rising, Jupiter's the Lord. This is problematic. Then, in any horary or muhurta kind of situation, we're looking at the ascendant occupants, the ascendant lord, but also the moon, which is another, significator of the individual under focus. So what do we have here? Whoa, well, this is not a great sign as well, too. The moon, as, a secondary significator of Russia, the attacker in this situation. Is there anything good about this? No. The moon is debilitated. The moon is in the 12th house. The moon is on the Rahu-Ketu axis. It is, unmitigated by the influence of any benefic whatsoever. So here's the moon isolated, and it's waning. That's not something we take much note of in Vedic astrology. But it's debilitated, and it's in the 12th house, and it's on the Rahu-Ketu axis. Not a good prognosis. Now, what happens as we sort of, go forward in time? Note the moon's degree, 13 and change of Scorpio. Note the sun's degree, 11 and change of Aquarius. So those two are, 4 signs apart. Now, if you know the moon's motion, basically, in about 7 or 8 days, the moon will catch up with the sun, and it will be a perfectly dark moon, a new moon, in other words. Notice the synchronicity of all this. We have the sun combusting Jupiter, the ascendant Lord, within 7 to 8 days. We also have the moon, another significator of Russia in this case, getting darker. And it passes over Mars, malefic in planetary war. It passes over Saturn, which is strong in its own sign, and it comes to join the sun in a new moon situation in about 7 or 8 days. So keep this in mind, this unit of time, 7. And we'll see how this plays out. So the war was launched on the 24th of February. Russia immediately set out with a very, very long column of military vehicles and supply vehicles basically on the road to Kyiv. And what happened along the way is that they were bombarded by drones and targeted by artillery and hit left, right, and center, and that column stalled out, and Russian soldiers were left basically freezing to death in tanks and trucks and other military vehicles that were basically like refrigerators on wheels, because remember, this was late February. And basically the Ukrainians picked them apart, and Russia's invasion stalled after about 7 days, roughly a week, and then a bit of a protracted bit of fighting in the area of the outskirts of Kyiv. But they never got any further, and they had to give up and turn around. Okay, so there's the first major failure in this whole campaign, and it happens, interestingly enough, right on the mark of approximately 7 days. Now, the war goes on with, bitter fighting, and Russia taking a lot of territory in the south and east. But Ukraine, meanwhile, puts up a very stiff defense, and also goes on the attack in many circumstances. 7 weeks after the launch of this war, 7 weeks, Ukraine targets Russia's Black Sea fleet, their fleet, the sort of lead ship, the Moskva, a destroyer. That was the flagship for that Black Sea fleet. They hit it with 2 Neptune missiles, damaged it so badly, set it on fire that it could no longer operate under its own power. It had to be towed, and sank before it got back to port. And of course, the Russians claimed that there had been a fire on board, munitions exploded, nothing to do with Ukraine, and it was an unfortunate circumstance, one of the haphazards of war. But it was a great setback, and it was the start of some significant demoralization in Russia among the diehards and the nationalists and the sort of war campaigners, the bloggers who were gung-ho for Russia to go in there and root out all the Nazis in Ukraine and reclaim this territory that was rightfully Russia's. It really gave them a bloody nose. And, people began to doubt, the story that Russia was putting out. This was the first of real significant doubts, because Russia lied about it for so long. And of course, the widows and mothers of sailors who died in the sinking of the Moskva had a lot of awkward questions for the establishment. And this is the beginning of the unraveling for, the Russian story of, supreme might on the battlefield. So things, continued to go badly since then. That happened, about 7 weeks in. That was sometime in, I guess it was into April, about mid-April, when that ship was sunk. Anyway, the war plowed on, a war of attrition and bitter fighting. Interestingly, and then sort of dragged down to a kind of a stalemate in some respects, where Russia was no longer gaining any territory, and neither was Ukraine. And they just fought bitterly for a period of months. Then, 7 months, I keep accentuating the 7. 7 days after the start of the war, Russia's invasion stalled out, and they had to withdraw their column from trying to take Kyiv. 7 weeks into the war, the Ukrainians sunk the destroyer, the Moskva. 7 months into the campaign, which is roughly into September, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, and in the space of weeks, they retook thousands of square kilometers in the south and the east, Kharkiv and a number of other cities that Russia had long held since the outset of the war. Ukraine retook them and pushed Russia back, and then, bitter fighting and a huge amount of bloodshed on both sides. But Ukraine clearly, were beginning to prevail on the battlefield in some significant way. And meanwhile, of course, other stuff was going on. In the Western world, sanctions on Russian oil, embargoes on all kinds of activities, closure of diplomatic relations with some countries, going after the oligarchs, cutting off financial support, denial of banking access, and any number of things which got worse and worse and worse for Russia's balance of payments, putting the squeeze on them every which way possible. And of course, increasing amounts of military aid just pouring into the Ukraine from a united NATO. Putin, ostensibly said, I need a buffer between me and NATO, and that's why I have to eliminate Ukraine as a threat. Well, he actually made it worse for himself, because now Finland, who had been independent forever, and Sweden, independent forever, both stepped up and said, we want to join NATO as well too. And now, as we speak, Ukraine is being considered for admission to NATO. So Putin really put his foot in it and made things even worse than they could possibly have been. It's like his worst nightmares come true as a consequence of this misadventure. So the last thing I want to say about this particular horoscope is the theme of 7. So we saw 7 days play out. The invasion stalled after about 7 days, a week into it, and Russia, had to sort of retrench to some degree. 7 weeks in, Ukraine sunk a Russian destroyer, which demoralized, the Russian war bloggers back home. 7 months into the campaign, Ukraine launched a major counteroffensive, which regained a lot of Ukraine territory. Now, what could happen 7 years out? It's, for me, unthinkable that this war could last 7 years. But look back in history, and whether they've been, small wars or large wars, some wars have dragged on for an interminable number of years. I say it's unthinkable, but in a way, I guess it's not. That's one thing. Could this war last 7 years? And if it does, who's going to win? Well, again, on the basis of this chart, I'm confident in saying that Ukraine will win this particular war, and Russia will be defeated in their campaign to have retaken Ukraine as part of Russia. What's the other thing that could possibly happen? Putin's overthrow or death. Again, given current events, it seems, improbable that he could live for another 7 years. Well, we're further into it now than that. I mean, we're dating back to 2022 and counting 7 from there. So it would take us into 2029. That's another 6 years. Could he live that long? Allegedly poor health and all the rest of it. But extremely paranoid and hiding out a lot. And he knows that there are those who could, as Prigozhin has done, turn against him. So it's not impossible that Putin loses power and disappears from the scene. It's also not impossible that Russia, as the current state we know it now with its current territories, might also diminish even further in the space of 7 years, because there are many sort of sister states still under Russia's control and domain. Belarus, for just one example, for instance. that may, begin to chafe at, the collar around their necks and use a weakened Putin or a weakened Russian state as their opportunity to set themselves free. I mean, all that could transpire by 2029 as well, too. I'm not going to venture to say that, but I hold out the possibility based upon this, intervals of 7 units of time, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years, all of which are, signified in this particular horoscope. Okay, I think that's enough to talk about that, and I will go back to Putin's chart for a little bit now. Okay, so now briefly back to Putin's chart before we wrap this up. So recall that, he launched his special military operation under Saturn Dasha, Jupiter Bukti. Jupiter in the 7th house, 7th house is the place of war, and of course Jupiter and Mars in Parivartana. In your mind's eye, you can have Mars and Jupiter exchange places, and then you'll see Mars in the Aries 7th, being instrumental in provoking the launch for this. And of course, Saturn, gives the results of its nakshatra dispositor, which is Mars, which is in the 3rd house of adventurism, which is in this exchange with Jupiter in the 7th, the place of war. So, okay, all that got underway in, in the winter, spring of 2022. But where are we today? Well, in December of 2022, specific dates that would be moot, depending on his birth time. I mean, using this birth time, of 9:19 in the morning, if all this is correct, he would have changed Dasha's 10th of December 2022. We need not obsess upon that day, even that month, because as you know, the movement of Dashas is like a massive, ship making a turn in the ocean. It doesn't turn on a dime, it makes a big swooping curve. And so for some of these dashas, especially the long ones like, Saturn, Mercury, Venus, Rahu, it can take months for them to segue from one set of circumstances and conditions to yet another. Anyway, be that as it may, Mercury Dasha started in, let's say, December of 2022. Now, what's happened since then? Over the course of the winter, they basically, hunkered down, Russia and Ukraine, in a war of attrition that, sort of bled, both nations severely in terms of, manpower lost and or wounded. And, the casualties are really mounting up. And, we see different numbers, but, numbers as high as 100,000 on either side are, seem to be credibly, presented by independent Western analysts. So it's been severe, no doubt a lot of losses. And so, Saturn occupies the 12th house of loss for Putin. But so too does Mercury. And now we're into Mercury Dasha. Mercury, is under the affliction of not one but 2 malefics in this circumstance. Now, even though Mercury is Swarashi, indeed exalted in Virgo, it is also Sandhi. It's in technically the very last minutes of arc of the sign. So, although it has strength by occupation of its own sign, it also has, considerable vulnerability as a consequence of being Sandhi. I mean, it's destabilized anyway, courtesy of the association of 2 malefics, Sun and Saturn. But it is also, precariously balanced on the cusp of signs. And you can think of this somewhat like a burglar creeping through backyards, and each backyard is separated from the other by a fence that is, taller than he can step over, and so he gets one leg over, and for a little while there, he is, in a very vulnerable position, perched atop of a fence. That's the analogy I like to use because it can be descriptive, and it sort of reflects Putin's circumstances right now, that The ground is shifting under his feet, and it's not a very safe place for him to be. As a consequence now, he's really, ever since COVID, he's been super vigilant about, communing with other people. And we've all seen these photos in the media where, he will hold meetings with his defense minister and, some other principals seated at a table, like a massive banquet table where he's at one end and they're at the far end. And so he really keeps his distance from people, physically, and now even more so. Apparently, he shuttles back and forth between the Kremlin and any one of a number of secret dashas out in the Russian countryside, fortified, bunkered, moving about in a armored train, ostensibly now using body doubles for some of his public appearances, because he is literally quite frightened of what might happen to him. He's seen other dictators come and go. Gaddafi, that one really frightened him, apparently. Although Saddam Hussein was caught and dragged out of a hole and later hung, there was a jury, sort of a formality to it. But Gaddafi's situation was quite different. He was caught and beaten to death by an infuriated mob. And apparently Putin watched that video over and over and over again, and it scared the hell out of him. And, he, can reasonably expect that, if left to fate, something similar could happen to him. So he's hunkered down and really very much in hiding. Now, I don't know that he would ever go into exile. I mean, this chart could suggest something of that nature. And, there's been talk about, the Congo, where, the Wagner group had a strong presence. In the Central African Republic as well, being possible getaway safe places. I can't see Putin doing that and going into foreign territory that is unknown for him. More likely he'll cling to power as long as he can and have a private army to protect him. But certainly the notion of insulation and isolation and hunkering down in a bunker in order to be safe might be, his world for quite a little while. So he's in Mercury Dasha for the rest of his life. Just over the next little while, things can get, increasingly difficult for him. We've already seen, secret enemies, open enemies indicated by the 6th house, typically. Secret enemies indicated by the 12th house. And we've seen this one where Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, who did so much heavy fighting with his troops in Ukraine, suddenly, turned on Putin and, began a march on Moscow until, they threatened him with, violence against his family and those of his troops. And so now Prigozhin is in exile in Belarus, but supposedly, logically, Putin's put, an order for a hit on him, and we'll see how long Prigozhin lasts. But the whole activity, Prigozhin's, daring do, if you like, will have enabled others to think, well, Putin is weak, he's sick, he's scared, he's losing power, he's losing control of his narrative. His job is a very lucrative one. He has made literally billions and billions and billions by being, the leader of Russia. There'd be lots of people who might say, I could do that job, we could do that job, let's get rid of him and take over. So this is not a good place for him to be in, and I believe it will get worse, over the next couple of years if he lives that long. But look ahead to the spring of 2025, transiting Saturn and Rahu will both be in the 6th house, along with Mercury, the Dasha Lord, along with Venus, the ascendant lord, and the sun at the same time. There's a load of heavy transits going through that 6th house. This can bring out open opposition of some form. I mean, 6th house can be very competitive, but typically, open enemies. And so we'll see. I mean, he may be very much struggling with health issues at the same time too, because Saturn in the 6th house is not a good prognosis for health. This is sort of the halfway through the Saturn cycle. Saturn opposing its own position, opposing Sun, opposing Mercury, the Dash of the Lord. And these are very problematic years for him, 2025, 2026. So it remains to be seen how this will play out, but certainly he's losing his grip on his narrative, his control of the country, and his own fate, if you like. So we'll see how this plays out in due course. Okay, that's enough for Putin's chart. Okay, I'm going to call it a wrap there. This turned out a bit longer than I intended, but this is what happens when you start trying to dovetail more than one horoscope into the same discussion. I urge those of you who haven't read those particular articles, and especially those who are interested in Amsha Vichara, the analysis of divisional charts, and their great utility in rectification. It can be a bit of a struggle with the divisional charts. You can get many of them working, but not all of them at the same time. I mean, that's a bit of a conundrum, but be that as it may, it's still a very useful technique. So again, that article on Navamsha.com is called Vladimir Putin, the Spy Who Came Home with the Gold, posted November 2018. The other article that I wrote regarding the Ukraine war shortly after it was launched, that was posted in March 2022, and it was called Planetary Wars, Russia and Ukraine. But I think I've recapped most of those ideas in today's video as well too. Okay, thanks for hanging in, and I hope to see you again soon. All right, bye for now.